Dan Azzi, welcome. Very, very good to be talking to you. We have 1,000,000,001 questions to ask you about this shit system we find ourselves in. First and foremost, how are you?
Good. I only have time for 1,000,000,000 questions, not 1,000,000,001. So I'm giving you a heads up from now.
Okay. No, sorry, I was pushing my luck with that one extra one, but I thought I would try my hand. What I do want to ask you, how inevitable was the economic crash that we find ourselves in today? Because it didn't just happen over the past year.
It was inevitable. It was inevitable. It's just the size of the crash that was avoidable. And the procrastinating and postponing the tough decisions makes it worse. It's not like wine. It ain't gonna get better with time. So there were several nodes of decision making along the way where the crash could have been avoided or minimized. So for example, if we go back to 2008, at that point in time, if we had floated the currency, for example, that would have totally avoided everything we're going through now. Like the Lira would have actually appreciated. It would have gone to 1,000 if we did that because of all the funds coming in. Of course, this is retroactive vision, which is 2020. And I can't even pretend that anyone could see that was the right choice at that moment in time. The next node would have been in 2011 when the balance of payment turned negative. So that's again a situation where we should have done something else. And then the biggest node is 2016. In lieu of the financial engineering transactions that the central bank did, he should have done what he's doing now, floating the Lira. So if he did that, the losses would have been way, way less. Now, not to talk about him without representing his point of view. So the central bank governor's point of view is that he was just buying time until that's his words, not mine. Reforms happen, and he was waiting for Sadr and all that stuff. But in my opinion, even if Sadr had come in $11 billion, and even if they had given us the money to do whatever we wanted with, which they weren't going to do, it would have bought us 11 months, literally $1 billion a month. So it would not have avoided the losses in deposits and the destruction of the banking sector.
So why is this called the biggest Ponzi scheme in history? For anyone who's maybe outside of the bubble, who doesn't have their money in a Lebanese bank, why are people calling this one of the biggest Ponzi schemes ever?
Because for the size of the deposit base. So the deposits were at the high $180 billion. And since there was no real investment on the other side. So normally what a bank does is you give the bank money, the bank lends a consumer to buy a car loan, a mortgage, a business, whatever. And as the borrower returns the money, pays back the money, the depositor can then get his money back, and the bank earns the spread. So what happened was that the banking system did that for a long time, but they evolved, or let's call it devolved, into lending the government at the beginning, which is kind of not as bad as people make it out to be. But the gravest mistake made was to lend the central bank the money, because the central bank does not have the ability to pay back any dollars, because the central bank does not have what's called taxing authority. And if you lend Ghazi Wazni money, Ghazi Wazni can impose $100 cash tax for every person that lands in the airport, right? And that's how he could theoretically return the money, assuming he doesn't borrow too much money. And he didn't borrow too much money. $30 billion in Eurobonds is not as big as it sounds. On the other hand, the banks lent the central bank 100 today. As of today, it's $108 billion, 80 billion of which is dollars. So when the central bank spends that dollar, he has no way of getting it back. So what the banks did was to keep the system going, or the Ponzi going, by attracting new deposits with high rates to pay off the old depositors. And this was going on, except the rates became so high since 2016 that the money coming in no longer was sufficient to keep it going. And that's when it collapsed. And every Ponzi, by the way, collapses that way. So if you look at Madoff went on for decades. The way he was caught was during the 2008 crisis, when people were so afraid they started to pull their money. He couldn't get enough new investors or depositors fast enough to cover the redemptions. So he was caught. So same thing here. What happened here is that the banks could no longer get that money in, and when they went to the central bank to get their money back, he couldn't give it back to them because he didn't have it. He'd spent it.
And do you think that when, just like out of something that really interests me, when the banks increased the rates for deposits at a very substantial amount during the mid-2010s, do you think it was done purposely in order to try and lure people into depositing their money into certain accounts? So because they could forecast that a certain crisis was about to come?
Well, it didn't happen. In 2010, the rates were still reasonable.
I said mid-2010, sorry.
Yeah, in 2016, what happened was the central bank suddenly, I mean, look, it started out with the fact that they didn't want to increase the rates on Eurobonds. So if you look at the Eurobonds interest rates, the ones we just defaulted on, you're talking the rates were 5 or 6%. The highest rate ever paid on a Eurobond, the recent ones, were 7.25%. So the Ministry of Finance, the central bank, I don't know who the decision maker was. They didn't want to issue these bonds at a rate higher than 7.25 because they wanted to keep saying, and you've seen this on TV and other places, they keep saying our rates were low relative to Turkey and Egypt. You've seen several senior officials at the central bank brag about that. In reality, that was what's called the on-balance sheet, what people saw. But behind the scenes, this financial engineering transactions, they were paying rates that were way, way into the double digits. In fact, there was one gentleman who went on Marcel's show, and he admitted to have been having himself received 31.25% in 2016 on US dollar deposit. 31.25%. The gentleman later became a member of parliament, and he admitted this in a session of parliament as well as on Marcel Ghanim's show. 31.25%. So the lending rates, of course, the banks were earning even higher because they were earning a spread. So they were passing on the 31.25, but they were getting paid up to 40% or 42%. So those were the real borrowing rates at the marginal level.
And I wanted to ask, could we have started to, like, we as consumers, could we have started to predict that, shit might hit the fan when we saw our real estate sector starting to become, really at unease? Basically, late 2000s, we were having like a really thriving real estate sector. A lot of foreign investment was coming in. And then when the banks were offering these crazy interest rates, all of a sudden we had unfinished developments. No one was buying apartments and houses anymore. So could the real estate sector have given us a bit of a notion of what was to come?
Actually, it was two different problems. And they were both happening. There was a real estate bubble, which was supposed to crash a long time ago, but due to lack of transparency. And what happened was there was collusion among developers, real estate professionals, the central bank, the government, everybody, the media even, to hide the fact that the real estate crash had started. In fact, the real estate crash had started, by my calculations, somewhere between, depending on the region of Lebanon, somewhere between 2008 and 2010. But people didn't realize that the crash had happened because they weren't told. So, I mean, think about how someone like you would buy an apartment. So you go and your only knowledge of what the apartment is worth is basically what the guy's asking, right? You don't know what there's no publication anywhere that tells you what the apartment next door sold for, right? All you have is rumors and innuendo and theories. So an unsophisticated buyer would have been overpaid. Now, when he brought in the scam loans and the subsidized loans, which kept the scam going, the real estate bubble going, what happened there is you as a consumer didn't care what the price was. You cared what your monthly payment was. In fact, when you were negotiating with the seller, you wouldn't ask him how much you want for the apartment. You'd ask him, what are my payments going to be? And the guy would set it up in a way to fraudulently allow you to buy it with no money down. And they would sign something saying you paid the money down, and they would structure it such that you end up making a payment which to you looks like a reasonable payment. However, you as a consumer were way, way, way overpaying for that apartment. And this was how they kept the bubble going. So there were two separate problems. There was the real estate bubble, and then, of course, the central bank realized that the scam loans were just helping the balance of payment deficit. Because what happened there, the problem with the lies that happened there is that new developers kept entering the market because of the prices being held artificially high. This is in Economics 101, you study this stuff. if the price is artificially high, excess supply comes into the market because the business plans are built on the higher prices. So that's why you saw for years and years all these empty apartments people kept building.
Yeah, I remember when I used to be young, like I would say maybe when I was like around 12, 13 years old, I was actually fascinated by the amount of new developments that were going on, not just in Beirut, but all around Lebanon. You see all these modern projects, and they actually, you know, from like just by observing them, you would think that these developments are really well built and well maintained. But I'd always ask myself, I was always curious, like, how many people can actually afford living in them? And now, you know, 10 years later, you actually realize that most of these developments right now are actually empty and nobody can actually afford living in them. So as you said, like, I guess all the way that they were valued was basically based on speculation, disregarding any proper intrinsic value. Am I right?
Yes. The ultimate irony, by the way, is that there were a lot of prizes distributed in those days to Lebanon, to the central bank, for avoiding the subprime crisis, right? But when you lend people that should, when you lend somebody making $20,000 enough to buy an apartment for $200,000 and with no money down, guess what that is? That is exactly subprime. So the irony of the whole thing is we got into subprime after we saw the devastating effect that subprime had in the United States and other countries.
Yeah.
It's funny because I can imagine, like, I imagine this as like a New York five-family mafia situation where the big real estate players and media players and banking players and government officials meet behind closed doors on a round table, agree to collude and all this shit. Like, I have this picture of like a very Godfather type of scene in my head with that going on. And I've seen a bunch of your talks, and something, you've been very vocal about was the decision to peg the Lira to the dollar. You're not a fan of that decision. And this goes back to, I think, in the 90s. So can you talk to me why you weren't a fan of that and the shit that basically happened because we pegged the Lira to the dollar?
There's nothing wrong with pegging a currency after it collapsed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. This is normal to bring back what's so-called trust in the system. Everybody does it. The problem is that we went on with the peg for so long. Usually countries that peg, there are very few countries that peg and succeed, by the way. The exceptions are the Gulf countries, and really they have an income that is in the currency they're pegging to. The petrodollars are, they peg to the dollar and they have petrodollar income. But even there's a lot of pressure about the peg. Hong Kong is another successful example. Again, I'm not going to get into Hong Kong. I lived there for 4 years. It's a totally different animal. But in general, countries that peg, they end up blowing up. One of the reasons why, because what happens is you no longer have an independent monetary policy of your own. Effectively, it's like that joke about North Dakota and South Dakota. So South Dakota says, what are those guys up there called? Somebody says North Dakota. Well, we'll be South Dakota. There's no original thought. There's no originality. You have to import the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. If Jerome Powell, a man whose name you need to know if you're pegging to the currency of the United States, that's the Riyad Saleh of the United States. If Jerome Powell decides to raise rates because inflation is heating up in the United States, we have to raise rates. However, for us, it could be lowering rates is the right choice because we have the opposite problem. We have a recession. So that's one of the problems. The second problem is we don't import all our stuff from the United States. The third reason that the peg to the dollar is a bad idea is because we have some geopolitical tension with the fact that they are sanctioning a third of the population. So it's a very, very bad idea to peg in general, but specifically to a country where we have a chunk of the population that has decided to get into a boxing match with Mike Tyson.
Boxing match, yeah, exactly. And for anyone now who has their money in the banks, for anyone who can't take out their money, send it abroad, pay for their kids' college tuition. أنت برأيك, يعني this is just me as an average consumer asking you, what do you think is going to happen to the money in the banks right now long term? There are rumors that yes, they might exchange what you have in the bank for shares in said bank. Is this basically? But I want to get Don's opinion.
First, you have to look at the numbers. One of the things in Lebanon that we're very, by the way, financially illiterate in the country. I was on a Zoom the other day, and you cannot imagine the amount of nonsense that's propagated. There are people here that are, like they're the dumbest motherfuckers you could ever imagine that are opining on this issue. And it doesn't take an economist. Like, I'm not an economist or an expert on the economy. What I am is an expert on common sense. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. You don't really need a PhD in economics to analyze that this whole thing was totally fucked up. If we look at the numbers, and I'm going to teach you subtraction here because we know how to add in Lebanon, but for some reason we don't know how to subtract. So when the central bank governor says to you, he is now down to the mandatory reserves, 15% of deposits, and he doesn't want to spend those, right? What is he telling you? He's telling you that he spent the other 85%. So out of every dollar, there's 15 cents left with the central bank governor. When the central bank governor issues a circular, 154, and tells the banks, you guys need to bring in 3% of your deposits in so-called fresh dollars, real dollars, as opposed to monopoly money. What is he really saying? He's saying that even if they meet the circular, that means that they do not have 97% of the deposits, of the fresh deposits.
And another reason as to why we got here, I remember I was at one of my older relatives was trying to explain to me the whole reason behind the financial collapse in a very brief way. As you were mentioning earlier, like, we were a country that heavily relied on import and we weren't really self-sustainable up until this point in time. So the trade deficit every single year was really high. But the way through which that trade deficit was covered was due to the fact that you had a lot of foreign dollars coming into the country, whether it was through foreign companies, whether it was through tourism. And two of these things, which were major factors in bringing in money, got cut off because foreign companies started retracting and moving their companies out of Lebanon, especially through like interference when it comes to political interests of the Gulf countries. And due to what has been going on with the pandemic for the past 2 years, our tourism economy, our tourism industry has completely crashed. So how can we, in a certain way, become more self-sustainable?
Like, I'm going to give you a bit of a different take for that. It's approximately correct.
All right.
We've always been, as your relative said, we've always been dependent on imports. The thing is, we had enough dollars, like your relative said, that sustained it. The deficit was covered basically by expat remittances, FDI, tourists, etc. When 2008 came, 2010, there was a one-time event that occurred. The global crisis meant that a lot of Lebanese who had their money outside Lebanon, because remember, interest rates in Lebanon in those days weren't attractive enough for them to take the country risk. They had their money in Swiss accounts, Luxembourg, France, Italy, wherever. So when the global crisis happened and there was, major banks were under threat of going bankrupt. The fifth and the fourth and the third largest investment banks in the United States disappeared from existence. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch. These are banks, some of them 150 years old. They disappeared. So a lot of Lebanese moved their money to Lebanon. So there was a surplus, not a deficit, of $20 billion in those days. When $20 billion walks into a small country like ours, right? What happens there? It flows into the economy. Except it didn't flow in a very smart way. What happened is, like you mentioned, there was a lot of these stupid towers that were built and other stuff like this. Now this moves the economy. It creates jobs. It creates taxes. It made the government bigger. It did all that stuff. So the GDP per capita increased in those days to a level that's very high. In other words, our imports increased. So what we did is we assumed that the money that came in 2008, 9, 10 would continue to come in ad infinitum. So come 2010, it actually stopped. It went back to the old levels. So at that point in time, because our per capita GDP is so high and our import level, that's when the deficit became high. So there are factors like you're mentioning that reduce the money coming in. But the main factor is the fact that our standard of living demanded more spending of dollars. I'll give you an example. So when you talk about tourism, the last few years before the crisis, tourism into Lebanon, if you look at tourism into Lebanon and then Lebanese tourism out of Lebanon, it was equal to almost about the same amount as tourists in the countries. In other words, it canceled each other out almost. There was tourists into country was slightly more. Why? Because it was cheaper for an average Lebanese making a Lira subsidized salary at 1,500 to fly to Turkey or France or Bulgaria. And you could see this from all your friends with the Instagram photos in Mykonos and Boardroom and all these places 3-4 times a year. This was all taking dollars out of the country. So it canceled out the dollars that were coming in. The other one is, one of my favorite, is the foreign workers, domestic helpers, Syrian workers, Egyptians, blah, blah, blah. This money, remittances were, say, at the high, $7, maybe $8 billion. 57% of that money went right out because of these foreign workers. 57%. In other words, the typical Lebanese guy sending money to his mom and dad was basically paying for 57% of the maid. So, he might as well have sent the money right back to the Philippines. And, it's the guys in Dubai sending it here. Just send it to the Philippines. Don't even bother sending it here. So this was the main issue. So all this other stuff you're talking about, the Syrian war, geopolitics, sure, they were factors. But it didn't change the fact that the crux of the whole thing was a Ponzi scheme and an unsustainable way of life. Yani, if we maintained our lifestyle at the level of pre-2008, we would have been okay.
But Dan, I mean, we all knew the system was a bit fucked up. Hala, you've found a very poetic way to show us how fucked up it was, and a very eloquent way. But you saw consultancy firms, hala, I'm not sure which one sent in, but there were plans on how to make Lebanon more sustainable. I remember somebody suggested this whole idea, one of the big consultancy firms, of building casinos and really upping our tourism. And I don't know who it was, and they sent it to the government, and we had certain politicians come out and say, yes, we saw said consultancy firms' plans, and we're going to be trying to enact them. So I think there were plans being sent around of how to make Lebanon more sustainable, but then it goes back to government and nothing was enacted. So going forward, are you confident we can make it more sustainable if we still have the same people running the shit show?
Look, I'm going to say something that's not very popular. Even if you look at the analysts and consultants that were looking at this stuff, they all missed the real crux of the problem in the first place. The litmus test of a consultant, if the consultant understood the problem, is where's his money? I have friends of mine who are CEOs of the most important banks in the world, okay, have their money in dollars right here. A lot of these consultants have their money stuck right here in Lebanon. So pretty clearly, they were consulting based on certain formulas and cliches, and they didn't themselves understand where the real problem was, because there's a reason for that. Same thing with the analysts, the economists, because everybody reads the same book. And when you go and take an economics course, whether you're with the IMF, an analyst, or whatever, okay, what do you read? It's always it talks about debt to GDP ratio, right? If you look at the media and reporting and analysts, there was always the fact that Lebanon had the third highest per capita debt to GDP ratio in the world. Remember, it was Japan number one, Greece, and then us. This is what they were concentrating on. And in fact, it is to an extent a problem, the fact that we had at the time something like $90 billion in debt. But what they all missed is the $110 billion in debt at the central bank. Not only that, the 90 billion, 60 of it is Lira, 31.2 is dollars. On the central bank, 80 billion is dollars. In fact, if you look today at our debt level, so this is 60 billion today at a rate of 15,000. What is it now? Something like 4 billion. The euro bonds are trading at 10, 12, 13 cents, right? So that's 4 billion. So our debt now is 7 billion. We have the government debt anymore. It's gone. Even if we restructure, like we pay double the market rate, and we're talking 10, 11, 12 billion dollars. So our debt to GB ratio, game over, it's gone. It's now below 100%, whatever the Lira is at today's rate. So that leaves the other debt. What about the 80 billion with the central bank? Guess what? It's still the same thing. It hasn't gone down. So the central bank still owes the banks pretty much the same amount of money. So what they're trying to do to solve that problem is to print Lira at 3,900 to get rid of the problem. And they are spreading the problem to every Lebanese citizen who earns a Lira salary. You see what I'm saying? So all the stuff that they're talking about, like building a casino, 80-90% of building the casino is all dollars flowing out. Balance of payment. In fact, the central bank, that's the reason the central bank stopped the Iskan loan. He realized that these guys building, they're importing the glass, they're importing steel, they're importing Italian marble, all this bullshit, right? And then they're overcharging these people. So in other words, it's all aggravating the problem. That's why he stopped it.
We were also talking about like self-sustainability, and I think over the past few years, a few interesting articles and documentaries have came out about like the Lebanese like drug business and how Lebanon's considered to be one of the biggest exporting countries of hash. And I don't know which consulting company wrote a report about it last year as to if Lebanon legalized it, it could actually help solve so many economic problems within the country. But do you think that one of the main reasons it's still not legalized is very similar due to the fact that our country loves to privatize things? For instance, like the electricity industry, where you have like a monopoly as to people privatizing generators. And do you think that's one of the main reasons as to why we can't be self-sustainable? For instance, why not even legalize hashish? Because the people in power actually make more money off it if it's illegal.
Look, I'm not a big fan in the first place of the Dutch disease, natural resources as the solution. There's a lot of people talk about legalizing hash. Suddenly, it's gonna be great, or if the oil and gas in the sea, all that stuff. If you look at countries that rely on natural resources, what's also called the resource curse, the Dutch disease. There's a lot of different names for it. We actually tried that. We had a form of Dutch disease. We had a form of oil or natural resource, which is expat money. And effectively, that's what we were doing. We were using expat savings to sustain a lifestyle that's unsustainable. So in my mind, legalized hashish is already being sold illegally to the outside world, right? Nuh Zayt is selling it. So what you're saying is, if we legalize it, suddenly this will solve the problem. If you legalize it, it doesn't increase the amount that is going to be sold. The world demand remains the same. So if you legalize it, all it does is it transfers the revenue of Nuh Zayt to partly or all to the government. It doesn't the guy in Amsterdam that's going to smoke a saruq hashishi is not going to smoke too because you decide to legalize it in Lebanon, right? Especially if you put certain constraints on it, like medicinal and whatever. So again, it's a positive factor to legalize it if we can sell some stuff. But the main, if you look at the most important companies in the world today, Apple, Amazon, etc., what are they selling? Right?
It's an actual cloud service.
It's this stuff. It's an idea, right? Even Starbucks, even Starbucks, coffee. We've been drinking coffee for thousands of years. What did this guy do? He came in on a napkin and said, "Hey, you know what? I'm not going to charge $1 for a cappuccino. I'll charge $4, and I'll call the person that works at the bar barista instead of a waiter." Right?
And we bought that shit. We're like, I'll have all the baristas in the world. I'll pay $50 for a cup of an espresso, 100%.
Yeah. And now it's a multi-billion-dollar company. So to me, the future solution of Lebanon is all about selling ideas, not selling stuff. Digging holes in the Mediterranean, okay, and extracting and destroying the environment. We're already doing that, by the way. If you look at the highway, the highways of Lebanon, بكفية العيعات المتن السريع. Look at what they did to that mountain. And, they took that mountain as if it belongs to them. This mountain belongs to your grandkids, and they destroyed it to turn it into these monstrosities of concrete. Sold it, right? Built عشوائيا مظبوط. This is not the type of economy we want anyway. The type of economy we want is a guy like you sitting and trying to come up with some type of an idea for some type of a business, right?
I see what you mean.
The way that I was looking at it though, when it comes, for instance, let's say we legalized the hashish industry and we started exporting it, that in itself can allow you to create certain companies that specialize within this domain, meaning you could create more job opportunities within the country, which means you could start branding you could create certain brands of weed, blah, 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 and export that outside. So I was looking at it more, because we were talking about self-sustainability, I was looking at it more in terms of job
generating
creation.
jobs, yeah.
So you legalize it, you let the industry start running a bit.
Yeah, again, I'm not against legalizing it, but again, there's no magic bullet like that. It takes a lot. The first thing we got to do is stop the bleeding of dollars, which is going on a diet. Let's look at Lebanon trying to run a marathon. Lebanon right now is got a sucking chest wound and is lying on the ground, needs ICU. So you can't talk about the patient running a marathon yet. The first step is you stop the bleeding, you put that oxygen thing, you stabilize the person, then they start walking on crutches, and then they start running, and then they start running long distances until they run a marathon. So same thing with Lebanon. The first step we got to do is reduce our dependence. We have to go on a dollar diet. We have to reduce our dependence on imports by executing targeted tariffs on unnecessary shit. You don't need hundreds of thousands of foreign employees in the country of Lebanon. And if you took a country like the United States, which is arguably one of the most successful countries in the world, if you took that and you said, okay, let's, they have a minimum wage of $15. You say, okay, open it up now for Mexicans. They can come in for $1 an hour. What happens there? Hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans lose their jobs, right? So they have protection. Same thing with Europe. You think you can move to Europe today and then just go take a German job? You can't. So what we did in Lebanon, we said, okay, for blue collar jobs, shitty jobs, I'm going to allow these foreigners to come in and do them. The guy who puts fahmi on your argili, the guy who puts gas in your car, as if that's a job that's necessary. In respectable countries, you put gas for yourself, right? And so on. But white-collar jobs, you're not allowed. Yani, a Syrian cannot come in and become an accountant, for example, or work in a bank. It's very difficult for a foreigner. I think we have in banks, we have maybe 2 foreigners that came in, the Greek guy and the Jordanian CFO of one of the major banks. And those are anomalies. Generally speaking, we don't hire foreigners for these types of jobs. We hire foreigners for medial jobs, but even medial jobs are dangerous.
Dan, something that I've noticed as well in regards to the protests when people go down on the streets, we can take a lot of shit as Lebanese, but when you start to fuck with people's money, that's when people will go down on the streets. And what I mean by this is when we started to see in the news that the Lira has hit 16,000, 15,000, 14,000, people take to the streets, and rightfully so, start campaigning against the government. Hala, I wanted to get your take on the exchange rate, what's happening in the black market. You hear a lot of people in the government saying, oh yeah, there's market manipulation going on. There are external forces, and there's always fucking outward blaming to other people. Could you explain a bit just what's happening with the exchange rate in the black market?
So the long-term exchange rate is dependent on, very simply, supply and demand. And the fact that there's no longer support for the exchange rate from the central bank. First of all, let's start with the history here. A lot of people don't realize the exchange rate fell outside the peg, not after October 17. It fell out of the band in the summer of 2019. It started trading out of the band is 1500 to 1515. So it started going to 1520, 1525, 1540, 50, 80. The Minister of the Economy back then, Mansour Btesh, went on TV, defended, said it's okay to be out by 10%. The central bank governor said the same thing. So there was a policy shift to move it by 10%. In fact, at the time, I made a statement saying that either the central bank is lying about the reserves he has, or he's happy with the going outside the band. This is the statement I made. I spoke to them a few days after that, after me saying that, and you'll notice I published an article supporting the black market exchange rate at the time, because what I got from them is that it was on purpose. And it was the right decision. Because they could not let the peg go officially because of political reasons, what they did is they did it surreptitiously. When you move it into the black market, and a lot of people think he lost control of the peg. He didn't lose control. He let it go because he wants, by the way, devaluation is a form of tax. If you read basic economics books, it's called the inflation tax. It's a way to tax you. And if I can't tax you directly, I tax you through inflation. So what he did was he wanted to reduce imports. So he basically made the traveling very expensive for you. He made it very difficult for you to transfer money outside. He made it difficult for you to buy cars. All that stuff has dropped tremendously. So in the long run, the reason the Lira is collapsing is because you're printing too much Lira and there's too many dollars going outside the country. It's simple as that. In the short term, absolutely there's manipulation. Manipulation through rumors, speculation. People think they're smart. I know a lot of people when it went to, when it went to 15,000 or 14,000, they started buying. The opposite of what they're supposed to do. And then when it dropped to 7 or 6, they started selling. So this type of manipulation happens so that they screw the average Joe, But in the long run, obviously, the Lira will keep on its track of devaluation up until 3 or 4 major decisions are taken. And I've delineated those, and I can go through what they should do to stop the devaluation and even strengthen the Lira.
Yeah, please let us know.
Okay,
What are those decisions that are gonna do that?
So there's 2 things. The reason there's devaluation is, first of all, as we said, you got to reduce imports. The way you reduce imports is you target the biggest imports and you tax them heavily. So not only do you remove the subsidy down on gasoline, you actually tax it heavily. If you look at the price of gasoline in the United States or Europe, 80-90% of it is not profits for the Gulf, the GCC. 80-90% of it is taxes in the country itself. And the Gulf makes 10 or 15% of that money. That's it. So most of it is taxes because they don't want you to be burning that much fuel. So what you do is you tax it heavily to reduce the carbon the hydrocarbon footprint in the it's good for the environment and it's good for the country to do that. And you replace it with other stuff, by the way. It's not like, okay, you make it impossible for somebody to go to work. That's not what I'm saying. But so gasoline and diesel fuel is the major thing. The next thing is, we talked about it, foreign workers. Cars, things like cars, V8, V6 cars, they should be like Singapore. In Singapore, if I want to buy a Range Rover, it costs me $500,000-$600,000. That's what we should do in Lebanon. Tax it so heavily that everybody, like in Paris, if you guys have been to Paris or those places, you'll see that most cars are deux chevaux, 4-cylinder, etc. Only in Lebanon, you see a rich guy has a brand new Range Rover and a poor guy has an old Range Rover.
Yeah, that's a good sentence. I know what you mean.
Yeah, it costs you to fill up your Range Rover in Lebanon. It costs you like $12. It's cheaper than Saudi Arabia. I mean, nobody has a human right to fill his Range Rover with cheap gas. It's ridiculous for us to be spending that kind of money, even in the crisis we're in today.
And Dan as well, because we were on the topic about how, there's like devaluation going on with our currency, and something that I've been personally fascinated about, like a topic in general, is decentralization recently, and even like if you look at it to a certain form, like anarchy, and like decentralization is when you have like the transfer of power from a certain entity, and you basically spread that power to small individual entities. Would you say that Lebanon has been a decentralized state, or is heading towards becoming a decentralized state at this point in time?
I mean, look, the country in general has always been, the average person, at least if you look at a long period of time, not necessarily your lifetime, but my lifetime, there's been a lot, we haven't had any major expectations from government, whether it's electricity or water or whatever. So that what is called, what people like to refer to as Lebanese resilience, I call it Lebanese acquiescence, acceptance of abuse. When you don't have electricity and then you go and have a generator and end up paying 5 times the cost if you fixed it in the first place, that's not resilience, that's stupidity, right? So in some ways, there is that type of decentralization in the sense that when you have a generator in your building, effectively you have a republic in your building, right? So yes, from a philosophical perspective. However, our taxes became very high. And in the old days, when I was growing up, when taxes were low, it was okay to do that. But taxes became very high. In fact, and this I didn't notice this. Nassim Talib noticed this. If you look at the primary fiscal deficit of the Lebanese government, it's actually flat. We don't have a deficit. We don't spend more than we make. The reason there's a deficit is because of all the debt. So what that means is that since you and I know there's too many employees in the government and we waste a lot of money in the government, what that means is our taxes are too high, not too low. You see what I'm saying? So the solution isn't necessarily by, of course, jibayi, collection is bad, but that's not the solution. The solution is to be more efficient in how we're spending it, of course, and collection of taxes, not necessarily raising taxes.
This is not necessarily, but because we're on the topic of decentralization, this is not necessarily Lebanon focused, but I guess you could put it there. What do you think about adopting e-currency or cryptocurrency? I mean, that in a way could be a viable solution. And for some people that have completely lost faith in government and institutions, maybe this is, something that could be more sustainable.
It doesn't solve the main problem. If you want to buy a tire for your car, you can't make a Lira to do it. Pirelli is not going to accept that. Pirelli wants a US dollar or a euro to sell you the tire. So it doesn't change the fact that the reason we have a crisis is because we don't have sufficient dollars to maintain our lifestyle. That's the problem. Whether you adopt a Lira, whether you peg the Lira, whether you use the dollar instead of the Lira, whatever you do, you still have to solve the problem of the balance of payment deficit. So even those that are screaming for this new thing now, they think they invented something, the currency board. The currency board is basically a way to peg what it is harder to get out of it than a normal peg. And the assumption there is like Riyad Salemi was walking down the street one time. He sees this hot chick walking by and he's whistling. And then he trips and the peg is gone. Riyad Salemi stopped the peg because he's running out of money. So, if you do a currency board, for example, as a way to maintain the currency, all it does is it says, okay, you can't print Lira if you don't have dollars against it, right? What does that mean? That means automatically all the deposits turn to zero, 100% the haircut. You stop paying your army and that. So the guys coming up with this are people, living in a nice, safe country like the United States where there's law and order and you don't have coup d'etats, every few months, and you don't, it's people that live in the first world that come up with these stupid solutions that don't work in the third world. So the main issue for why our currency is being decimated today is because we are spending too much money, too many dollars, and because we're printing. So you stop, if you want to stop the bleeding, you stop printing Lira at 3,900 to pay the deposits, right?
Yeah.
And you stop spending more dollars than you bring in.
And we gave
Oh,
we gave a lot of the technical details about what's wrong with the system right now and why the economy is the way it is. But also a huge reason is, let's face it, corruption. This country, corruption is second-hand nature. It's embedded in every single fucking aspect of this country is corruption. And something people want to know, because when we're on the topic of justice and getting shit done, is the stolen funds that have been taken out of this country. The average person will tell you, we're never going to see those stolen funds again. They've sent them to Switzerland and they've sent them to this and they sent them to this. So what I want to get your opinion on is, are we ever going to see stolen funds by these politicians restored and returned? And has there been examples like this in the world? Like, has it happened outside?
Like, I don't like it's a catchy slogan, okay? The return of the stolen funds since 1975. It's a very catchy slogan. The problem there is there's due process. You can't just say, you pick your favorite bad guy, you say this guy stole money, right? Everybody agrees he stole money. But prove it to me. I mean, like, what? First of all, the theft in Lebanon, to a large extent, was legal, was within the system. And the reason it was legal and within the system is because we acquiesced. We colluded with it. We allowed it to happen. You kind of alluded to it at the beginning by saying people, when it hit their pocketbook, that's when they hit the streets, right? In some ways, that's the way it is. The Lebanese, right down to the bone, is corrupt as a culture. The other day I was walking down the street. There was a guy parked on the sidewalk, blocking the way. So this I'm gonna post this video. This dad with his stroller, his baby, he has to get off the sidewalk and walk in the middle of the highway, going like this. Please don't run me over with my baby, right? And I'm watching and filming this from behind. You know what I'm saying? So the selfish bastard who parked on the sidewalk threatened this guy's life and his baby's life, right? With cars honking because they don't even want to be patient while this dad walks with the stroller and the baby, right? So what happened in Lebanon is that there was a bastard who screwed this guy with this dad with his baby, with his toddler, right? But then there's a bigger bastard who screwed the guy in the parking lot through the deposits or the lira. So it's always about the big fish eating the smaller fish, eating the smaller fish. That's the way the country has always functioned. And when you accept the fact that there's no electricity since 1990 and you still vote for the same people over and over again, right? Then you have to bear some responsibility for the situation we're in today. You have to bear that responsibility.
And we actually got into an interesting conversation in our last episode that we recorded. Now, I have this idea which might be a bit controversial, and I don't know if you might agree with me or not, but I always say that our problem is not a political problem, it's more of a societal problem. Like, even if we do get rid of these politicians, as you mentioned, we have so much corruption embedded within our blood. Like, every single action that we want to do in our country, you can't get anything done in the country unless you know people أو عندك وسايط to a certain extent. وبحس هاي هي المشكلة الأساسية عندنا بالبلد إنه if you really want to improve Lebanon, it's not about the politicians, it's more about us as a culture that need to adapt and innovate.
I mean, I totally agree with you. In fact, when you've been doing something wrong for so long, you stop realizing you're doing something wrong. Like, I walk around a lot. I don't drive except when I have to. So I walk around town, and when you get to the zebra crossing, when you're crossing, and a guy will cross the zebra and block you. He'll just block you. And then you have to go around him, right? And then
they don't even understand what the zebra crossing is here.
So this guy doesn't realize that what he's doing is immoral, illegal, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So it's like embedded in our culture to break the law, to not respect law and order, to not respect other people, to not respect other people's space. It's normal. So the other problem is this is a generational thing. And in my generation and my dad's generation, it was normal for my grandfather to vote for the Zaim, who's the grandfather of the current one. My dad voted for his son. I voted for his son's son. And my son will vote for his son's son's sons, right? Of course, when I traveled outside, and I'm like, well, wait a fucking minute. Why is it happening this way? Like, your generation traveled virtually, if not physically. And therefore, you guys were, you saw that this was an anomaly that shouldn't be accepted. But there is no accountability. And if you're voting for the last 100 years for the same name, that means that person does not have to deliver on the stuff he was voted
So-
into power for. This is why this guy who took the vaccine, remember the deputy?
Yeah.
A bunch of deputies took it. This guy has been living in this type of shawaz yani for so long. He doesn't even realize that what he did was immoral, to the extent that he went out and he started yelling and he wants to fire and kick out the head of the World Bank. And this guy, we are begging the World Bank for a loan so we feed our people because we are a semi-failed state. And this idiot wants to kick the guy out of the country and is making fun of his name.
To play devil's advocate, hello, no, the government doesn't magically appear. The people at the end of the day are the ones who are going to vote for the government. And essentially you get the government you deserve because you put them there, in essence. Hello, playing devil's advocate, what people do say is that they create a system that makes you vote for them. What do I mean by this? They control the media narrative, the economic advantages, they provide security for their local clans, and there's this essentially we don't have a state, it's tribes, it's being protected by your tribes. So playing devil's advocate, people will say, yes, technically we are the ones who voted for them and everything, but the system they've constructed heavily suits them and gets the average Joe to be brainwashed into voting for them. So I think it's a double-sided sword in that sense.
I want to address something before that you mentioned about the system. I don't think they were smart enough to construct the system the way it happened. I think the system sort of evolved. It evolved just like monkeys evolved into humans. It evolved in a way, and the survival of the fittest, our acquiescence, a lot of it made it this way. And the system survived to a large extent because it was built on a guy like you being unemployed. And a guy your age, if you look at the unemployment rate in Lebanon, there was a study about this. So the average unemployment, even before the crisis, was something like 30%. Among the youth, it was something like 40%. Yeah. Among old people, between 60 and 64, you know what the unemployment rate was? I read one World Bank report that was something, it was like lower than the United States. So the system is designed that older people maintain their job security and you are unemployed to the extent that, I don't know you guys well, but my parents, your parents probably, the expectation was that you were gonna go and do a grad degree somewhere, you were gonna go work on the GCC, you were gonna immigrate to whatever, and the whole point, the whole system encouraged you to do that so that you will get a job outside and send money in to maintain the artificially inflated salary of this guy who's 60 years old. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying.
So the system evolved in this fashion, and you were expected to do it. If you are an American kid, 18 years old, you never think, okay, when I graduate college, I'm going to leave America. You don't think that, right?
Yeah.
And very, very few people in Europe or America leave their continent that they were born in, right? Maximum, they leave the state or the city, but not the whole country like we do. The expectation is that we all immigrate, and the system was very happy with that. Even if you look at the dollar al-Tallabi, why did they pass the dollar al-Tallabi? Why didn't they pass the dollar al-Tibbi? And if we're talking human rights, would you allow someone to transfer dollars out because he needs a double bypass operation that he can't get in Lebanon? Or he needs a bone marrow transplant for cancer? Or dollar al-Tallabi? Why is the dollar al-Tallabi the one they allowed?
Yeah.
Even though they're not applying it properly. Because the dollar al-Tallabi means that kid is going to get a job outside one day and transmit dollars.
Send the money back. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Just to kind of play devil's advocate, and something I did want to ask you just to kind of wrap up, and this is a bit off topic, but just because I've seen this conversation going around. Israel has now been making peace agreements with a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, and I've heard the narrative saying this is so fucking bad for the Lebanese economy because now in essence, why would any of the multinationals want to come and start a company in Lebanon? Because back in the day, you could do this because Lebanon had human capital and Lebanon could work with Dubai and Saudi and Qatar and blah, blah, blah. But now that Dubai has made that Israel has made these peace treaties with across the Middle East, this might be at the detriment to the Lebanese economy. So I wanted to get your take on that. What do you think the peace treaty Israel has been conducting with several countries is going to do for Lebanon?
It's definitely catastrophic. I've been to the Gulf for the last few months, and I happened to be there when the whole thing was signed. And within days, you could see all these citizens of Israel that were filled up the whole country. It's not like Egypt, which even today you can't see it. It's just the transformation has been remarkable in terms of the acceptance and that stuff. So on the one, of course, in theory, you're definitely right. It is definitely a negative because there's a lot of overlapping skills and now we have a new competitor that we didn't have before.
Yeah.
No question about that. Of course, we have a lot further to go in the first place before we worry about that. This problem you're talking about is a problem that we will worry about when we get to here. Right now,
I see what you mean.
Right now, you're talking about, we don't have a port. We're talking about 50% unemployment. We have some major issues of the devaluation of the currency, etc. And it's a little bit arrogant of us to think that we can even compete with them at this stage in time.
I see what you mean. And I did want to wrap things up by saying I see on your T-shirt that you're officially retired, but what about finance minister in a supposed secular government? Would you ever be interested in taking up a position in government?
No, because I think I can influence things better from the outside than the inside.
Fair.
I'll give you an example. For example, the World Bank loan. Okay, as you know, it came in they were going to pay it at 62.40, and I led a whole big lobbying campaign in media and among foreign diplomats to the extent that I killed the 62.40 rate along with like-minded people that were supporting me in this thing. If I were a minister in the government, they would have told me to shut the fuck up and stay in line.
The book, basically.
So it's a small victory. Remember, by the way, it's not only about the World Bank loan. There's about $1 billion and a half in foreign aid that comes in, and banks were stealing. The central bank or banks, by the way, a private company, were stealing 50, 60, 70, 75% of that money that was intended for for the needy. So this is I think it's a major victory for people like us. And look, in Lebanon, we sometimes have this cliche thing, you have to be in a position of authority for you to make change. I think I've met more diplomats in my non-position than the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Lebanon. If you count how many diplomats I've met over the last year, with, I'm not talking 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I've sat with them for 3 hours in some cases.
Yeah.
Some of the top diplomats from all over the world, from the most powerful countries in the world. If you look at that, I spent more time with them than people that are appointed officials of the Lebanese government. So in my mind, it's not about what the position is. It's about how much influence you can have. That said, I don't think we've achieved a lot when we look at how much we need to achieve.
And on a final note, we always like to ask, recently we've been asking our guests this to get different opinions. Where do you see Lebanon in the next 10 years? In what direction do you think the country is heading to?
Look, we are at a fork in the road today. And if we do, what, again, Sharb al-Nahas coined this term. I took it because it's the right one. Equitable distribution of losses. توزيع العادل الخسائر. If we do this stuff, and we do some of the stuff that I told you about, we can get out of this crisis within months. When I say get out of it, I mean it starts turning around and the country starts rising again. On the other hand, if we continue the way we're going, and I wrote this in an Royale article that's called The Path to Armageddon, which tells you the whole story. If we continue, we're losing, we have a lifeline, like a cat has 9 lives. We have a lifeline which is losing 3% per month. So within somewhere between 16 months to 3 years, we will become Mogadishu 1993 if we continue on this path. So the answer to your question is, where do I see us in 10 years? Depends if we go down road A or road B. We have only a few months before we reach the point of no return. If we continue along this path for the next few months, and we reach the point of no return, then this problem is going to be a very bad situation for the country in 10 years, for the next 10 years.
Dan the man, pleasure talking to you. Super insightful, and if I have any other financial questions, I'll be sure to spam you at 3 a.m. So look out for my messages. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.